When you watch shows, do you binge them?
Ooh, that's an interesting one. No, because I typically when I watch them. So when I listen to shows on podcasts, I don't because I listen to them while I'm exercising or doing
Yeah,
something,
yeah, fair.
which time limits it.
But TV shows, movies,
Oh,
etc.
terribly so.
Yeah,
I
yeah, yeah.
I haven't watched a TV show in months, years actually, even at this point. Or I don't think I've seen a movie. I've seen
Yeah.
one movie. I saw what was the deserty one, Space Deserts,
Oh, Dune.
Dune 2.
Yeah.
I saw Dune 2 in the cinema and that was it for the last ages, frankly. So
Wow. That's a good one to come in for. Did you skip Dune 1?
no, I saw it on a plane. Thank
Okay,
God.
okay,
You know,
cool.
it's a long one, so you really want to be tied in for that one.
Yeah, yeah.
So the morality of open source hardware. You know, we've had open source norms and software for a while, but there's definitely, I'd say, more poignant questions when it comes into the physical
It
world.
changes things.
It changes things. And like the top question around ethics in open source for software, it's been decades, is intellectual property, attribution, and then beneath it is sort of the safety.
Yep.
So are you familiar with a really famous case back in I think it was 93, that Zimmerman, are you familiar with who Zimmerman is?
No, Zimmerman.
He created PGP.
Oh, okay. So yeah, PGP, one of the most massive companies ever, builds tons of consumer products, right?
PGP makes cryptography. They're pretty good.
PGP encryption. Okay.
Yeah, so Zimmerman was part of the sort of the free software movement back in the day. And back then, anything with over 40 bits of encryption key length was considered ordnance and required an approval from
That's
the US
right.
government to export. Have you heard this story?
Yeah, I've heard this story. Like, basically, this is kind of where a lot of foundational open source stuff came from, right? Because he wanted to, I think it was like, there was a lot of process or something to share his code.
Yes, exactly. And so back in 93, he decided that he wanted to release PGP. It was using RSA keys to secure and authenticate messages. And that was using at least 128-bit encryption, which was considered like military strength encryption. Over 40 bits was considered unexportable. And the US government designated it as a munition. And so what Zimmerman did is he went to the MIT printing press and had his code printed into a book, which anyone could OCR in another country or anywhere else in the States and get the code, the source code to recompile.
So because he put it in a book, it was like free speech or something
Exactly.
like that. Yeah.
He used the First Amendment to protect his ability to publish source code. And after that, the US government pursued him. He was prosecuted for this. And the court decided at the defense of the Electronic Frontier Foundation. They defended him and they established that source code is free speech. And I've got a quote here. The court can find that no meaningful difference between computer language, particularly high-level languages as defined above, or German or French. Like music and mathematical equations, computer language is just that, language. So it's pretty cool. We've established now that source code is free speech, and therefore, if you wish, you are free to share it, and it has all the same copyrights as everything else.
Right. So this is kind of the basis for open source being basically always okay. You can release software. It's the same as speech. If that software starts fires, it's
no warranty, ideally, with the MIT license.
Right. No warranty. You can release that.
It's up to you whether you build it and certify it or do what you want with it. This is just the intellectual property behind it. It's the concepts or the knowledge.
Right. But this can't be the same for hardware. Like, because obviously there are rules for exporting hardware. So what does this change about open hardware, right? Open hardware, especially hardware defined in code, is going to kind of straddle these worlds, right?
Absolutely, it does. That's why it's interesting for us. So how do you reconcile the design as speech? Would you consider drawings for like how you manufacture? Let's take something difficult like ordnance, for example, artillery shells. Those drawings, are they protected as free speech?
I would think you can't. Yeah, you really can't share those. But that's IP owned by somebody. So,
but if you created it, a drawing doesn't, I mean, unlike this quote of there's no meaningful difference between computer language and French or German.
Right.
I don't think you could say the same thing of a drawing, a 2D schematic of exactly how you would go about building something. But for our higher level languages of how to describe circuit boards, all of a sudden it does reintroduce that.
Gotcha. So drawings don't have this same right, or at least we don't know yet if drawings have this same right. The argument was computer languages are similar to French or German or English, and we can't restrict that speech, so we can't restrict any of it. But a drawing you might be able to restrict. That might be not free speech.
A drawing you might be able to restrict. And like the concrete outcome of this is, for example, obviously with the war in Ukraine at the moment, there's a huge number of drones going both directions over that battlefront. Now, obviously, any electronics design tools are most likely to be used for those purposes of creating that ordnance at the end of the day. And so we in the open source hardware space need to reconcile with, are we okay with that?
Yeah. That's really interesting. I'm kind of I'm still on this drawings are not allowed thing. I'm just thinking about it. That's actually crazy, but it's totally true. Photos, like there are photos you can't release, but generally speaking, with any text, like you're allowed to open source that text if you have the right. If you created it, not with somebody else's intellectual property, you could basically create any text you want. You can't create any drawing or photo you want. There's a lot of rules around drawings and photos. So now we have this new thing where if somebody creates code that does something bad, that should have the same rights as any piece of text around free speech.
Exactly.
And so for the first time, people building hardware have to reconcile that. If you build the code, electronics code that represents a drone, that drone could be used by someone, and you're not liable. But nobody's stopping you, so you have to reconcile that ethical dilemma.
Absolutely. It's up to us. And so we have to decide whether or not we want to do that, whether we want to promote the global sharing of knowledge in that way.
Oh, very interesting. So I guess like even and this isn't like down to licensing really too. If you have MIT or GPL or something like that,
yep.
Like people who use these things, they're not necessarily redistributing or forking or something like that. They're just using it. They're not really bound by that licensure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, maybe if you're a company doing it, you could wind up getting bound for it. But really, just the act of releasing the code in any way, you kind of have to think about this. It's not an issue of licensing.
So I could give you a really concrete example of actually this manifesting as well. My dear friend Tim, who you know as well, his previous company designed a remote control for drones.
Yeah.
And he has since seen a video of it being used in the war in Ukraine.
Whoa.
If you're in that position, and it was the Ukrainians using it, but you can imagine anyone could obtain access to that, particularly if you freely open source the design.
Right.
How would you think about that?
Yeah, it's weird. I know like a lot of people who build software, they feel pretty safe from look, if you're building something like Slack or
Yep.
a CRM, customer relationship management or whatever, you're not going to feel that much of an ethical dilemma. It's just helping people transact business.
Yep.
With hardware, you're almost always going to have something where your stuff shows up, especially if you build a motor controller,
Yep.
that could be used in a drone or a weapon or whatever. So no matter what, you're kind of playing into it. I guess a CRM could be too, or Slack could be used as well. Well, maybe everybody's got this dilemma to some extent. I don't know.
To some extent or another. I mean, like obviously Telegram and Signal, these cryptographic technologies are prolifically used, and their proponents say that the privacy and the free speech that they promote is well worth it. Do you think we need to justify whether or not we should be able to release the design on a product by product basis?
It's a really good question. I definitely think you should evaluate a design and make sure you're comfortable with all the ways it should be used.
I think that makes sense. Yeah.
It's definitely degrees. There's probably two parts for me. Like my mental model would be, how many degrees is it from something that you're not comfortable with?
That makes sense. So I think that's a really good test. And so you can apply that in the moral sense to something that might be used in a manner that you really fundamentally disagree with. And we've already discussed a little bit of the legal aspect of this too, that as soon as it becomes source code, it becomes so much harder to regulate.
Right.
But what about perhaps the quality and safety of your designs? For hardware as well, unlike software, if you design a really high voltage flyback converter, for example, What would you do with that design to ideally stop people getting zapped, or is it up to them?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Even if you release something simple, it always has the potential to catch fire. Anything will catch fire. So how much do you need to think about that? Obviously, like the simplest approach is to have some kind of disclosure, just to say like, hey, I haven't tested this here and here and here, and give all of that kind of upfront. But I actually know somebody who is doing a lot of open source hardware work, and they released almost everything they were working on. They were just open, but then so many issues were filed, and it actually became like a pretty big burden. People constantly were misusing or like trying to use it for different things, and kind of pointing out the flaws.
Yep.
And it was too much to maintain, and so we took them all offline,
Oh, really?
archived everything.
No way.
Because it is a burden to bear when people are frustrated with your code or your product, or they're doing things that they shouldn't be doing because you kind of tempted them into doing it by making it kind of easy. Yeah, you feel kind of bad. It's a little bit of a burden.
What if you offload that? Do you know if anyone's forked those designs because they'd already pulled the source code?
I'm
and
sure
republished it?
people did. I don't know if he hard deleted or like a GitHub archive. It'll still show up, but
Yeah.
like it's pretty clear, like don't create an issue, don't expect this to work, and it naturally steers people away a little bit.
That makes
So
sense.
I think that's where he was leaning. The other problem with hardware is it is such a IP intense field. It's very different than software. With software, you have precedents like if something is an API, it's free to use from everyone. It really doesn't matter if you've patented it or if you've everybody has signed an IP agreement, because there are rules around interoperability.
Yep.
And kind of free speech connected with APIs. How two systems talk together is kind of a free speech thing.
There's at least a norm, a de facto norm around it in the software world.
Yes, absolutely. So software has a very different IP situation. You can always kind of try to argue one of those points. With hardware, it's a lot more set in stone, and the IP around hardware, a lot of people don't like to share that. So what happens is a lot of times when you're interfacing a piece of hardware, which you do all the time when building hardware,
Yep.
you realize you can't really expose parts of it. You can't really open source your design because it kind of couples to this other design
Yep.
that you don't want to expose, or you signed an NDA for, or something like that.
Now, I'm no legal expert, but do you have any idea what the legal implications of sharing a design of patented technology is without commercializing that patented technology yourself?
That's a great question. I am not sure.
So we did look into this briefly, and the answer is it does seem to vary a little bit country by country. Do you remember, you know VLC Media Player. Everyone knows the orange little cone, of course.
Yes, the orange cone that plays any video.
Yeah.
Never a problem.
And they're based in France.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So they're based in France, or at least their builds are based in France and some of their IP is hosted in France. And my understanding of that situation is it's done because the French laws around open source and being able to read certain codecs and play things that might have patented codecs, which is, again, rare in the software
That's
world.
right.
But they're very loose and they allow you to do almost anything. So it's going to depend perhaps to some degree on what country the author of that is in. But I've never seen particularly much cross-border enforcement of that on somewhere like GitHub, sort of the public repository, obviously owned in the US.
Yeah. It's a little bit scary though, because GitHub will handle like DMCAs and handle those legal requests sometimes because they're kind of hosting your content.
Yep.
You could get your repo nixed, or even your org like in trouble, and you definitely don't want that. So I think I think it's going to be a different world as hardware companies start using software, just because they'll be tempted to use those normal mechanisms of sharing, of putting it all on GitHub, but they might make mistakes.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you see as the sort of economic impacts of open source hardware, sort of casting your mind into a little bit in the future, the really positive moral implications of this?
Yeah. I mean, I think what we'll see is it's going to be much easier to riff on designs. Meaning, if somebody builds a bad product, it's not like, oh, they're the only company that kind of knows how to do that. And so that, there's not going to be a derivative. You're going to see a lot of people fork that and create different versions and have open cores. So today, a lot of companies will use like RP2040 or like, whatever microcontrollers, and that'll be like a shared component. And there could be some things that are shared. But in the future, you could have a lot more being shared. For example, you could have an open cell phone where people can basically use that open cell phone in a variety of products. Like we have like recording equipment in here that could have open cell phone in it so that, you know, it hooks up to the booking software or something. So you know when somebody's recording and you don't enter the room. Like people will be able to just fork something and give it a lot of different
a lot of different life. Yeah.
A lot of different life. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, in the same way we see with Linux, it's in every embedded system. To say,
Right.
I'm sure this recorder here is running Linux itself. But okay, so you think about it in the economic sense of the reuse and the remixability. That definitely makes sense. What about the inclusivity aspect to people who perhaps don't have the knowledge today? Do you think it will bring in people from we mentioned last episode, Rwanda, for example, has a booming motorcycle industry. Do you think that open source hardware is going to bring more of the globe into the development process?
Yeah, absolutely. Building hardware, just like putting it together, is kind of hard today.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been getting easier and easier and easier. And one of the last missing steps is that the EDA tools are either expensive or still very hard to use.
That's very true.
Without EE knowledge. But like, since you can get full circuit boards assembled and shipped to you all over the world, like, we're going to reach a point where basically anybody can take one of those designs and get it sent to them fully assembled without any extra effort. So with that low barrier of entry, there's going to be a lot more circuit designers. It's going to kind of shoot up. They won't be the same though. It'll be a different breed.
You think it's more going to be like full stack hardware development, well, hardware and software development?
Absolutely. Like right now, you probably have like 3 types of engineers on a hardware product. You probably have the kind of cloud software guys, the full stack web. You have the firmware engineers, and you have the hardware engineers.
And that's really the minimum.
Yeah, that's really the minimum to ship something, and that's a lot of just labor cost for R&D. So if you could have that stack slowly go up, like, so if they can design the circuit, maybe they can do the firmware too. Maybe they can do the rest of the stack. You've got a pretty like efficient way to build electronics. What do you think is going to be the economic impact of open source? How does open source kind of change the industry?
It's totally an interesting one. So we've actually seen in software it kind of go the opposite direction, where we thought this, and it is a huge boon. Obviously, all of humanity is using something, like we took the example of Linux before. But in many ways, it's perhaps the biggest companies that have benefited the most, where it's kind of a write-off to open source some basic things to Google or Meta. But they do get to potentially pull in a whole bunch of free labor from either their own software engineers or somewhere else software engineers who wants to get into those companies.
Yeah.
And they'll just perhaps hire the maintainer in order to join the company. So there's a lot of advertising to it as well. Yeah,
I hire people, or I used to hire people a lot just based off how good their GitHub was. You don't really need to do a technical interview if last weekend you coded an entire app. Like, okay, I know you can code.
We got that, yeah.
So you could start seeing that in hardware. It's pretty hard, and it's certainly not recognized to have a portfolio of hardware. I think today probably people have their own blog, and if you have a really cool blog, then you could probably skip the technical interview if your blog is really good. But there's not really with GitHub, you literally have all these green squares, and you can kind of get a glance if somebody really knows their stuff.
So if you open source that hardware and describe it in code, as we both are, that's hopefully going to transpose to basically the same thing, the same green squares. Yeah. I think as far as the economics specifically go, I anticipate we're not going to end up with more product categories, realistically. I think that we've probably found all the kind of consumer level products that anyone really wants or needs, particularly in the Western world. We're so saturated.
Really?
With just like every I haven't thought of any device that I would need to build rather than buy. The bikey wagon's only marginal, and I'm doing it for fun.
I'll give you one. All right. This is my theory on the future of consumer electronics, which is probably completely misguided. Probably. But anything that I use my cell phone for that's annoying to set up, I think will have a dedicated device if they get cheap enough. So, for example, we were talking about Tonal a couple episodes ago.
Yep.
And the Tonal has an app that you can set up your phone, and it will watch your form as you're doing a machine. And they don't use it for this yet, but it could also be used to like count push-ups or count what you're doing off machine where it can't measure.
Yep.
What I would love is to just have a camera in my room that counted those things, but also I would love if it didn't send video data.
Oh, interesting. You wanted to do it locally.
I wanted to do it all locally so that there's no privacy concerns,
Yep.
right? It provably there is only number of push-ups being sent to the server,
Yep.
and I could just set it up once, and now I know all of my workouts in extreme detail.
That's interesting. That makes sense. Did you see that the new Sonos home pods or whatever they're called, the new Sonos does all of its voice command processing locally?
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
I thought it was incredible. And it's beyond just being good for privacy reasons, it's also fantastic latency wise.
Yeah. That's
It's
critical. You can't it doesn't feel like a conversation yet with most AI because it takes so long. It's pretty funny. Using Google Home is actually unbearable now. If you're like,
Oh, yeah.
okay, Google, and then you wait like 5 seconds, it responds, and then you're waiting 5 seconds again.
Yeah. Hey, turn on the light. Ah, no, I'll just go flick the switch.
Exactly. Yeah, people. I don't know. This really should have been one of the first. Now it seems very obvious that
Yeah.
the latency is absolutely critical. But I guess they had to wait for the technology to catch up.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so that's a really interesting dimension to this. It's the privacy aspect. Actually, bring us back to the start of this, the PGP,
That's right.
the signing and cryptography of this is with people being able to create their own open source hardware. For example, the speaker. If Sonos hadn't done it, someone could make their own fantastic speaker and actually embed that intelligence in that device.
Yeah.
What other do you have any other ideas for that similar application?
Oh yeah, like I mean, I don't know. Every day I just get annoyed at things. I get
Okay.
annoyed at normal human things, and I think there should be technology for this. So opening and closing windows. There are actually automatic blinds in a
Yep.
lot of places, but they're pretty expensive. I think like for like this window, it'd probably be like $400 or something.
That is
Small
high.
window.
Okay.
Yeah, it's pretty high just for blinds, which cost maybe $5
Yep.
for a pack of 8. But one place that has bugged me for the longest time, and I don't know why we don't have anything here, is occupancy sensing, privacy aware occupancy sensing.
Interesting.
Because booking rooms are a huge problem in any office space.
Yep.
And there are some things that do it, but there clearly isn't a solution that's just like everywhere, like that's de facto standard, kind of taking it. So I think this is because only a couple companies get a shot to take this every year.
That makes
Only like
sense.
3 companies get to try to make a booking sensor who can get funding for it because it's so tried, and investors, they start to not like an idea
Yep.
if it's been tried too many times. But in the future, it might be that anybody can try this, and suddenly there's an open source community for occupancy sensors, and then it finally gets everywhere. So
We do already see that with the home automation. The home automation
Yeah.
open source, those guys are going for it.
Killing
oh
it.
my.
killing it.
And it's like the firmware stack is obvious there, and they sort of base around a handful of chips. Have you seen how much open source hardware is available with those communities?
Yeah, it's funny because my last company did a ton of stuff with IoT devices, but I didn't play too much with Home Assistant specifically. So I don't really know, other than I know Home Assistant is really easy to hook into.
Oh yeah.
Like people build plugins for it. So if you just build some random hardware device, you can integrate it into Home Assistant.
It will
almost
happen.
definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like you can do it yourself. You probably just need to write like a small Python plugin or something, and then that'll all be processed locally, and you can kind of build the configuration of your dreams. but it hasn't hit a point yet where like I couldn't name an IoT device today that's like started from open source and is like around, like it's popular. I don't know. Maybe what's like a popular open source device?
The one that comes to my mind is the smart knob.
Oh,
Have
the
you-
smart knob.
Have
Yeah.
you've seen that project?
Yeah, so the smart knob is like you plug it into your computer. Actually, I think it's wireless, but it's like this really nice feeling knob, and as you turn it, it like clunks to each.
Yep. So the smart knob, it's incredible. So it's by a guy called Scott Bezick, I believe, and he's done an incredible job with this, where basically you have it's a little round knob that has a motor in behind it, and so it emulates all of that feeling. It has a motor and a screen, and if you're turning it, the detents that you feel are actually just the motor sort of emulating the feeling of a detent in behind you. Or you could make it springy, so you flick it over one way and it'll bounce back and forth.
Yeah.
And you sort of tap it. And so like this is it's a perfect example because it's how I want like a Nest Home to do my temperature to feel, or my oven control, or basically any tactile knob in my house, I want it to be one of these. And because this is an open source design, or open source artifacts are perhaps a better way to describe current open source hardware.
Yeah.
But if this design were embeddable in products, it would be absolutely my first pick of what I would want to, or
That's
how I'd want to
true.
interact.
Like drop in this knob, everybody would have that knob.
I would hope so.
You'd see that knob on doors. You know what I mean? Like unlock the door, it would be a completely virtual lock, and then then it would clunk
I'm
into
sure
place.
someone would sell that for sure.
Who doesn't love the feel of a good knob? When I was in college, we would do I think it was called tech dumpster diving.
Okay.
And we would go into tech dumps,
Nice.
which were places in the school where they would throw out old servers and stuff like
Nice.
that. And you
Classic.
would desolder switches,
Oh,
like
no
really
way.
nice clunky switches from like electronics that were built in the 80s and stuff like that.
Wow.
And so these were the best because back
That's
then,
so steampunk.
yeah, this is like the era of like springy mechanical keyboards and just stuff that
Yeah.
like really had that
That
nice
thunk.
clunk. Yeah, the thunk.
Love that. Love that. Yeah, so interesting. So look, final question for you today, and this is a thorny one, so I'll have to see if it makes the edit. But there was, I'm not the first to bring this up, and thank God, but with the attempted assassination of the former president recently, they're using typically pretty old technology for these types of things today, but it's trivial to imagine the type of threat posed in the future by, again, the platforms that exist today and are being used in wars around the world. Ukraine again comes up.
Right.
It doesn't seem like we have, let's say, a state or a legislature that's keeping up with whether it's AI or the proliferation of really complex hardware, sort of peer countries being able to manufacture things on a scale and to a high quality that perhaps they weren't necessarily a few decades ago. These types of threats are only compounding the morality questions and whether or not you should publish something questions around some of this open source hardware. Does that impact how you think about this problem or this challenge at all?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it definitely impacts, like, as you see these events going on, and see the implication of releasing not just like open source stuff, but anything into the world, right? Anything that's
true.
mass manufactured or something like that. I think you do have to kind of run that equation of how many degrees separated is this? Think through that usage, and you have to have some principles for yourself. Today, I don't know if it feels very offer on to me, whether people take kind of an ethical stance and they have, for example, a code of conduct on their repo.
That's true.
Or they have specific licensure that says, hey, you can't use this in a weapon, which is like, there's a type of license like that.
Yeah, Kim Jong-un is just, damn. My
just
bad.
walk away, right?
Ah.
But it is kind of important to be principled and consider the full stack of implications, and maybe change some behavior for that, right?
Mm-hmm.
I certainly wouldn't release a category of things in the first degree, like something that like a
Here's my
trigger
detonator.
switch.
Like, yeah, okay, that's not for me.
But the second degree things, right? Like I'm sure there are valid use cases for projectiles, like, I don't know, a paintball gun thing for practicing or something like that. I would even be very wary of the second degree, right? But at some point, you have to acknowledge that there's a lot of good that comes from open source.
Absolutely.
And so when you start getting third, fourth, fifth degree, like the good probably outweighs the bad.
Would you defend those people's rights to have published freely those other things? Because that's the thing with open source is someone else is going to do it.
Yeah, it's an important question because in both of our cases, we host registries.
Yes.
For people to upload electronics.
We do.
So what are the rules there? I haven't thought about this problem that much. Have you thought about this problem a lot?
Not. So I don't want to identify with any political group or something because it's very single issue for me.
Right.
For this type of thing, I think the internet should be regulated as a telecommunications company in the same way that phone and text message is, and therefore, they're not liable, but they have to transact in everything that is, or they have to transact in everything, and ultimately we chase down the individuals that are liable for doing the wrong things.
Yeah.
And so I think that it's perhaps not unreasonable. In Australia, for example, when you're buying a SIM card, you need to actually provide identification to get that SIM card with an address and your details and all that. It's obviously so that it can't be used for nefarious things. I think that you should be allowed to do almost anything you like under your own name. And I think that's really the principle behind the First Amendment. And if you are publicly gonna submit something like that, and whoever it was, the state comes along and says, actually, that category of things is a bit too dangerous to have out there. At least, the very least, you can chase up the correct people. It's not just completely anonymized.
Yep.
And you also have to personally stand behind this decision. You can't hide behind a username on somewhere or the dark web or that type of thing.
Right.
Which I think is probably the happy medium we, as the Western liberal democracy, should settle on, so we can maintain this freedom and this incredible economic growth that we have with the open sharing of ideas and knowledge. It's what's made us so great.
Absolutely. And if you think of how terrible it would have been if PGP wasn't released, even though there are arguments against encryption, right? But it would have been terrible had that not been released.
Incredibly
and so
bad.
Today we could kind of take a stand. I think maybe possibly future episode material is like actually looking at I don't know how interesting this will be, but like what are, how does GitHub think about these things?
Yeah.
I really want to know how big registries think about this. Do they do the least as possible? Will they kind of defend their users until some government gets involved or something like that? I'm really curious where people set the line. And then
what do you think of Twitter and the Twitter files, the direct manipulation side of things too?
Direct manipulation meaning?
Well, the whole Twitter files, which I'm not deeply embedded with, so I'm going to botch this a little bit. But roughly speaking, there was... I'm not I don't want to speak to the authenticity of this, but the gist of the Twitter files, quote unquote, is that there was direct manipulation of the stories that you were allowed to broadcast on Twitter. And if you had some certain keywords or sentiment analysis determined that you were talking about things you shouldn't, it would either shadow ban that content and not promote it, or it simply wouldn't allow you to post it.
Yeah, this is the whole freedom of speech, but not freedom of reach kind of thing, right? Where you can kind of move things around. That's really interesting. And a lot of it sounds pretty bad, like just show people what they like or something like that. But I can see like good arguments for like when I was a kid, I wanted to do really stupid things.
I did do really stupid.
Right? And like some of the content, maybe it would be good. And I guess for electronics with code, maybe this is relevant. Like a lot of kids like to play with airsoft guns and stuff like that, and would love to build a turret or a robot that shoots you.
Again, illegal in Australia. You can't get them, but
you can't get airsoft
guns. No paintball, no airsoft.
No paintball or
you
airsoft.
You have to be 18 in my state to play paintball, and you haven't got your own gun. You're going to a field.
Whoa, that's so interesting.
Yep.
Is that, from your perspective, is that too far, or is that like, yeah, okay?
Honestly, I think it's pretty reasonable. I'd say it's a great middle ground. It's actually a really interesting one as well, perhaps because Australia was in '96, introduced sort of a left-hand turn legislation to say, hang on a second, all right, no more guns. In the words of Jim Jeffries, all right, and the reasons for that were pretty bad. So let's not go into them right now. But now I'm not worried about there being firearms freely available in Australia, and I feel very safe. I feel very comfortable, and it's the case of like no one has them, or like highly organized criminals, and the police have them. And the highly organized criminals don't care about you. They're not going to mug you, right? They're not interested. The police, fantastic. We have well-trained police, and they typically do a really great job. But if we were to publish, let's go really extreme in the open source hardware space and say that you've heard of these ghost guns, these 3D printable guns.
That's right.
I don't know how prolifically they've been used in let's say crime, but I did recently read an article from the New York Times about them being used in Myanmar in the actual conflict there. And so it's clear that they're proliferating and that they are accessible and it's possible to manufacture them. And that actually contradicts the safety that I've enjoyed in my own country.
Yeah. Have you ever heard of, I think it's either the 80 or 90% rule with guns?
No, I haven't.
So I'm going to botch the details, but in the US, you are allowed to give the parts for something like 80%
I see.
of a gun. But if you go to 100%, that's too much of a gun. Slow down. So what people will do with the 3D printed guns are actually
Yes.
you can buy most of the stuff and you print the stock and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And they worked out some determination of
I think it's
how
the
much is
lower
okay.
receiver is the serialized component. Is that it?
It might be.
Okay. I'm pretty sure. So I'm pretty sure the way it's regulated is that the lower receiver is considered the firearm, the same way in that you have a VIN number on a chassis, and you can replace your engine, your wheels, or etc. with your car. It's the same with the firearm, and it's not a different firearm until you replace this one component. So if you can 3D print that, which is obviously, I mean, compared to something like a barrel, which obviously needs to be steel, you're not printing that. It needs to be smooth.
Right.
It needs to be a lot of things. But you can trivially 3D print that. But I kind of see that as a legal loophole in many ways, more than a like a very fundamental what's the technology doing question.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's very true. Yeah, that's super interesting. I mean, so I guess at some point, for legal reasons, we'll have to have policies on a registry.
Yeah.
I wonder how we'll come to that. That's like, I mean, I almost don't want to open up the can of worms here, but it would be a pretty cool episode to go into like different platform policies and figure out, okay, how do you apply what they have done for software to hardware? And I can't think of a hardware. I can't think of anybody else who's had this problem before.
No.
It's a really unique position.
What about have you seen what happens when you try to print money? Oh, sorry, photocopy money.
Something happens. Your printer rats you out.
Your printer will reject it.
You're kidding.
Yeah, there is a mandated mechanism in every printer to reject photocopying money. We can try it right now if you like.
What?
So what it does is there's a certain there's a dot pattern on the note that it detects as a constellation.
Oh.
And it has some kind of like, this is incredible, right? Because typically a printer is just like a fast microcontroller. So they've implemented an algorithm in these fast microcontrollers to detect this pattern. And on Japanese notes, it's a flower. On American notes, it's actually if you look at a 20, for example, there's little 20s in the background, and there's a section of them that are this constellation. Exactly. And in some notes, they're just simply dots. But any currency or anything that has this dot pattern, the printer will simply reject and say like unable to photocopy. And whether 3D printers in the future will have similar analyses to determine if a design is marked as dangerous in some way, or whether our tool chains will actually need to detect, hey, this is a regulated piece of whatever it is. This is regulated hardware. You need to be registered in some way to actually manufacture this hardware.
Right. So there's a precedent for this for sure.
Absolutely.
And it would be pretty cool if it was kind of like this privacy aware stuff where they had an AI built in. So like ideally you're not sending all of your designs to the cloud. But that is so interesting. It also might drive us to this cyberpunk future where people are using like squids for guns because you're trying to get past the AI. So you have to make your design extremely weird.
Yeah. Oh, God, I can absolutely see that future. Do you know, they actually do the same with CNC machines. So
really?
High-grade CNC machines, I'm not sure what the precise criteria is, but high-grade CNC machines will be geo-locked. You need a registered technician from that company to come out. It has an IMU in it and GPS positioning such that if you attempt to move that machine yourself, it will lock out that machine until you have a technician come and prove that it was by the same company, owned in the same location, all that type of stuff.
That's so interesting. Yeah, and I guess this is like a whole nother thing, but with advanced manufacturing, they probably want those machines kind of connected to the cloud and making sure that they're being used exactly how they want a lot because they're very precious, right? In the kind of advanced chip design. We got to do something on chip design too.
We got to absolutely do something on chip design.
But anywho, I think we killed it.
I think we've hit time there. Thank you very much, Seve. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
Always a pleasure. And
that's it.
Yeah, I'm just going to cut to black.